Hey YouTube, yo Augusto, thank you so much for joining me. Today is my interview with David Tuller, the esteemed health journalist who debunked the p.a.c.e trial. And I set up in this beautiful park to do that little time lapse and record, but then I've also managed to pick it at the exact time that they're mowing the lawn in the park. So let's move a little further away from that. 1 second. Okay, sorry about that guys. Let's focus on David Tuller because this guy, the reason why it's so important is because he debunked the p.a.c.e trial, which at the time was the biggest trial into CFS, costing £5 million and setting the standard for the treatment of the disease, which we've since learned is ineffective. Those treatments were graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy versus adaptive pacing, which is just doing as much as you can while staying within your energy envelope. What David figured out is that that trial had 4 major flaws, any of which should have basically ruled the trial invalid. Those are, remember this was published in the esteemed journal The Lancet in 2011. These flaws were the selection criteria were so loose that you could include people with depression and exclude severe CFS patients. The objective test was a 2-minute, 6-mile-an-hour walk on a treadmill, and as anyone knows, that's almost no exercise whatsoever. A cardiac patient would be comfortable with that. The recovery criteria was changed mid-study, so you could exit the study worse than you went in and still be classified as recovered. And fourth, and which I think is the most egregious, is that there was a massive conflict of interest which wasn't disclosed by the study authors, who were members of certain insurance boards and government panels. All this information wasn't gathered lightly. It cost the Queen Mary University of London £250,000 so that this information could be reported. So David Tuller's the guy who's put all this together. It's on his blog. He's kindly agreed to meet a few of the young CFS sufferers at a cafe in Newtown, so that's where I'm headed now. We're going to go have a chat with him, have a bit of a bite, and then we'll have an interview to follow, hopefully.
Great, thank you. P.a.c.e.man, yeah, P.a.c.e.man.
Yeah.
I forgot my P.a.c.e.man t-shirt at home. I forgot to bring it.
Okay, so that lunch went really well. Meeting lots of other sufferers there, and talking to David, who's very interested to talk to all of us. So now we're just going to move to another location where I'm going to do the interview. Here we go. David Tuller. Thank you very much
nice
for
to
joining
see
me.
you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is the first interview I've ever done, so...
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic that the first interview I'm doing is with a seasoned, hard-hitting journalist, so...
It's a purportedly seasoned, hard-hitting journalist,
yeah.
but yeah.
Well, promise to go easy on me if I muck
Okay.
anything up,
Okay.
but I'm just absolutely thrilled that you've agreed to the interview, and I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested to hear what you have to say. So, let's get into it. So, what brought you to our sunny shores, and how's your trip been so far?
Well, so far it's really been great. I've always wanted to come to Australia, but sort of never got it together to do it. And last year I crowdfunded for this project, and as part of my crowdfunding I said, well, hey, I'm going to do some traveling, and so I, as part of my work, I done some, so I went to, as part of my crowdfunding, I went to UK for a month in the fall, and I promised to come to Australia because I had been getting, in the course of my work over the last couple of years, I've been getting a lot of communications from patients, about the situation here, and I understood that there were difficulties here, similar in some ways to the UK, because of the links and because that the CBT-GET cults, as I like to call it, had taken root here, and so but I understood there were also some distinctions in the situation. So anyway, I just wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do when I came, but I figured I'd come, and here I am.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here. We've treated you well so far,
So far I've had a good time.
So far, so good. Good to hear. All right. So what originally sparked your interest in ME/CFS? Because I understand your first encounter was with your 2011 New York Times report on the p.a.c.e trial?
No, that's not quite. So I had a friend who got sick in the early 90s. I'm from New York, but I moved to California in the late 80s. And at that time, I moved to California to become a newspaper reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, which is a daily paper. But anyway, a friend of mine in New York at that time, early 90s, got sick with a bad flu, and so often, got sick again, and then just kept getting sick,
Exactly,
and
what
never got
happened to
better.
me. A bad flu never got better.
And then, at that time, they were calling it CFIDS, I guess, chronic fatigue, immune
Deficiency
disorder syndrome, immune
Sure.
deficiency syndrome,
Something
immune
like
disorder
that.
syndrome, something like that. And, nobody really knew what it was. It was at Epstein-Barr. We'd had this outbreaks in the 80s that people vaguely knew.
Yeah,
so it was
Lake
all
Tahoe,
very, Lake Tahoe, it was
yeah.
all very strange. And I didn't really know anything about it. And so, over the years, I just watched as his illness progressed. And, it was all very odd. But I didn't do anything about it, or there wasn't anything I could do, and I wasn't reporting about that. I did do the first story I wrote, and then in the 2000s, I was both going to public health school at Berkeley. I quit my newspaper job, and I was also doing a lot of reporting on a freelance basis for the health and science desk at the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first story I did was 2006 or 2007. I didn't really know anything about the illness then. The CDC had just come out with some studies about genetics, and they ended up not really meaning much of anything, but it was sort of an excuse to do a story. So I pitched a story to my editors of the Times, and I did a story. When I look back on it, I'm not that happy with it because I didn't understand a lot of stuff.
No, I don't think anyone did at the time.
Right. Well, I think some people understood, but it was 10 years ago or more, or 12 years ago now. So I did a story that was okay, and then that was the end of that. And then when the situation in 2010, 2011 started with the XMRV, mouse retrovirus idea, again, my friend sort of said, there's just interesting stuff, you should maybe, pitch the Times. And so basically, I didn't do the first story for the Times about that, but then, at the time, nobody's very interested in reporting about chronic fatigue syndrome, and I was. So basically, when there were developments, I started talking to my editors, and I ended up doing about, a dozen or 15 stories for the Times, I guess, but that was over 2 years, about, there were new studies, and then there were counter studies, and then there was controversy, and then there was whatever, and it all sort of happened over the course of 2 years. So that was a couple of years. In the middle of that, or right near the beginning of that, in February 2011, the p.a.c.e trial came out. And I didn't know anything about it. I hadn't heard anything about it. I didn't know that the patient community was all. I wasn't reading the patient forums, and I really wasn't that immersed in it, as I later became. And so what happens, in news organizations is that your editor says, "Oh, here's a new study. We need something by, whatever." So I had a couple of hours to look at this complicated study, read the press material, and whatever. Got to write 500 words.
Sure.
So I did, and I reported accurately what the study found, but of course the reporting wasn't accurate because the study's a horrible mess.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know.
No one knew at the time.
Well, patients knew because patients had been already reporting since it got approved.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the story though. You said that there's some patients are.
Well, I will say one thing about that story. It was bad, but it was better than all the others that were published.
Yes.
So I included a couple of caveats that they had. I think I mentioned that they had connections with insurance companies. I may have mentioned that patients were upset with the idea of psychotherapy, but that was about as far as it went. So it was sort of a typical story with a couple of caveats, but it basically took the study at face value. I would say almost every other story that appeared that day or in the next couple of days talked about, back to normal and recovery, which were the words that the p.a.c.e authors and their colleagues sort of put out there, even though the paper had nothing to do with recovery because it only talked about improvement. But they didn't include any of the caveats, at least that I included a couple. So it was a bad story, but it was better than most of the others.
Yeah.
I was at Berkeley in a class when the story was published, I think, and I then was going home. And then by the time I got home, I had, irritated emails, including from my friend that I had initially gotten me interested in, said, David, you really have made a problem on this.
Yep.
And, as I looked into it more, I got upset at myself, but it wasn't my fault. I couldn't have known because I had never heard of it before. So as I looked at it, I got more concerned about the study, but there was no way to change it. The story wasn't incorrect. It just was incorrect because the study was bad, but not because there was anything to correct.
Well, that was the information that the Lancet had put out there. So
right. And so one presumes that if the Lancet puts it out, one can we're supposed to be able to rely on it. It was supposedly peer-reviewed, although now we know that the peer review probably was a big mess, although they've been really mum about, basically all these studies are reviewed, they seem to all be reviewing each other's work and just saying, fine. So, a couple months...
But that was initially how you essentially...
That was how I got into the p.a.c.e trial.
Yeah.
A couple months later, I thought, okay, what can I do to sort of undo some of the damage I might have caused? And so then I ended up writing a story, I pitched a story to my editor about the problems with case definition overall. It was sort of focusing on p.a.c.e, but it was kind of like an overall story about the importance of case definition in epidemiology. So I tried to make it conceptual, using p.a.c.e as an example of an issue where they had a very broad case definition of the Oxford criteria of 6 months of fatigue, which is, as we understand, a very heterogeneous grab bag of whatever. And I wrote a story, and then I got an email the next day from Michael Sharp, who was one of the p.a.c.e authors, saying, David, interesting story, but you forgot to mention our subgroup analyses, which proved that no matter how you measure, no matter how you identify chronic fatigue syndrome,
So the authors hit back at you?
Yeah.
The authors sort of clarify.
Yeah. They wanted a correction.
Right.
Because what they did in p.a.c.e was that they identified everybody by the Oxford criteria, and then within that grouping, they did two subgroups of two other definitions. One was the CDC definition, and one was an ME definition.
Right.
The problem is that in epidemiology, if you're comparing three groups, and then they said, this shows that however you define chronic fatigue syndrome, in the letter they sent to the Times, however you define chronic fatigue syndrome, the findings are robust however you define it, because in their subgroup analyses, people reported, according to them, the same results as they got for the large sample.
Right.
The problem with that is that in epidemiology, if you have a group and then you have subgroups, you can't take the subgroups and then compare them to the larger group. You actually have to have three completely separate groups because you're using three separate distinct case definitions.
So does that become apples and oranges essentially for the
sort of like that. So basically it means that if you do it the way they did it, you have to presume that every single person who would have been identified by the CDC definition or the ME definition would already have been included in the Oxford criteria definition they used. However, the problem with that is that neither the ME definition nor the CDC definition required that fatigue be the primary symptom. CDC requires 6 months of fatigue. It also requires 4 of 8 other symptoms. Now, what we know is that some of those other symptoms, post-exertional malaise, cognitive dysfunction, and sleep disorders, and sometimes myalgia, muscle pain, are really core symptoms for many people.
Those are the hallmark symptoms for ME.
Right, and so someone might go to the doctor and present not with fatigue per se, but they might present and say, I just have all this cognitive stuff, I can't remember anything. That may be their primary symptom, even though they also have 6 months of fatigue. So those people might not have been included in your initial defining of your group.
Yes.
Therefore, you can't you've already defined out potentially a lot of people who might meet those other definitions. Therefore, their idea that, well, we did these subgroup analyses, it doesn't prove anything. It only proves that if you define people one way first and then you take subgroups of that group, they may perform the same. It doesn't show that if you actually from the start define a group of people by CDC or define a group of people by the ME definition, that they're all going to fall within that first grouping.
So that was the selection bias problem that you
Something like that, yeah. So basically, they wanted a correction. When I talked about it with I was totally opposed to a correction because nothing was inaccurate. I thought it was fine for them to send a letter, and my editor thought it was fine for me to respond to their criticism. So that was a perfectly satisfactory response for me. So they had their letter, and then I wrote a letter explaining why I thought their reasoning was stupid and bad epidemiology. So that was that. I doubt that they expected me to have a response. I think they probably expected to be able to
write their letter
and that, but I had a response that I thought was very cogent and made them look like idiots from my perspective. After that, I thought, okay, there's something screwy going on here, and I'm going to take a longer look at this study when I get a chance. So that chance really didn't come until a couple of years later. By then, they published the really completely ridiculous recovery paper that's completely a piece of garbage and totally made up. And then patients were, I was starting to read the patient material, and so by then, the next year, 2014, I had some time in the summer, and I went to England for a month, and I met some patients who were in the trial. I spent a lot of time with one in particular, and I met 3 others. I talked to, I met various experts that people know in the UK, and I spent a year after that writing a very long 15,000 word piece that was difficult to find a place to publish because who wants to read or run 15,000 words about chronic fatigue syndrome? Also, I was taking on the Lancet, and I was taking on very, well-respected, powerful people. And so I ended up running it on Virology blog, which is a blog about virology.
Any reason you decided to post there as opposed to your own blog?
Well, yeah, because I didn't have my own blog.
Sure.
And I didn't have any particular credibility as anything. I'm just, mainly a reporter. I have a public health background, but I'm not an infectious disease specialist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not,
Sure.
I have a kind of a interdisciplinary public health doctorate. And Virology blog had actually written, basically Virology blog is run by a microbiology professor from Columbia University, so it was sort of a well-respected site that people knew.
So people already knew.
People already knew
they
the
were
site.
drawn to it. So when it went up there,
it was already had credibility. So his site already had academic credibility, even though it's not a peer reviewed. It's just his own thing. He was very interested in this illness. It obviously has viral aspects to it. So as a virologist, he was interested in the illness, and he read my 15,000 words and said, "Great, let's go with it." And I really have to give him credit. This my friend Vincent Racaniello at Columbia, because basically he didn't vet it. He didn't run it by lawyers. I run it by lawyers, but he didn't. He knew me, so he assumed it was all accurate.
He gave you free rein.
He gave me free rein.
Vincent sounds like a top bloke.
And I could, if I'd been wrong, who knows? We could have been sued, really. And so he took a legal risk, and I took a legal risk with no protection. And so I had better have been right, and I was. And so, then I just kept writing because it just kept going on and on. There just kept being more and more to write.
Yeah. Well, and it's been fantastic to read it all, and I wonder how. So your work, as you said, is made possible financially via crowdfunding.
So what happened was, at first I was just doing it as a public service. I had a half-time, job with good benefits at Berkeley. So I spent a lot of my other free time. I need to work full time, but I had some freelance work, and then I spent a lot of time on this project because I could, and because it seemed important, and because nobody else was doing it. I didn't expect it to continue. I thought, no study can actually survive this kind of exposure of all its flaws.
So many flaws that it felt like.
It's incredible that it got published. If it was a breast cancer study or something, it never got published. If it had been published, it would have been retracted in 10 seconds after my story hit, but that didn't happen. So I thought, that's something, it's just wrong. And so it just, and then I started getting emails from patients like, "Oh my God, we've been waiting for decades, for years." Decades. The PA.c.e trial hasn't been out for decades, but we've been waiting for years for someone to this. And patients understood that I had listened to them and that I had taken their experience seriously. And then I also want to make it very clear that I based everything I did on what patients had already reported, in letters to journals, in their own blogs and postings, in commentaries to studies. So basically, I piggybacked on the incredible work that patients themselves from their beds, with their laptops had done. I mean, I was astonished at what patients had been able to do. The problem was they were patients, and the investigators were able to portray them all as crazy, hysterical, death threat making, harassing, irrational, climate change denying people.
Yeah, malingerers.
They all had this disease or whatever, and they tried to. I think they thought they could treat me the same way.
Right.
And they wouldn't talk to me beforehand. They ignored me. And then afterwards, they protested that I was potentially causing reputational damage and so on and so forth, and all my misinformation. And, we gave them, of course, a chance to respond, as is appropriate. They had their chance to respond on Virology blog a week later. Their answers were completely ridiculous, incoherent scientifically, full of misinformation and lies, I will say. And I responded. I smacked them down with my response. I think I totally answered all their things. I thought, this is just wrong. I couldn't believe it. And my colleague, Vincent, was just astonished at their behavior. And in every step, I don't know why, I continue to be astonished at how awful their behavior is and how awful their science is and how the entire UK medical and academic establishment has defended this total garbage. It's just garbage. It's a piece of crap. All the studies associated with it, surrounding it, are all total nonsense. And I just got very upset and committed to continuing.
Right, and so that's when you turned to the public to fund
well,
it?
So what happened was I worked on it for a couple of years. I took 4 or 5 trips to Europe, all self-funded. And then what happened last year was that the University of California is never in a very good financial state, and my job for 10 years had been sort of jury-rigged together with funding from a grant and funding from another grant and funding from this pot and that pot.
Yeah.
And that had been enough every year, so I'm a year-to-year appointee.
Right.
I'm not a tenured faculty. I had a faculty position at both the Journalism School and the Public Health School, but I've been reappointed year to year, and every year there's been enough money for my half-time salary and my benefits, which are health insurance, which you have to have that to work, or you pay huge amounts of money. And so last year, that money just kind of dried up.
Right.
And I thought, okay, I can drop this project, or I can do what I didn't want to do, which is monetize it. And someone said, why don't you crowd? I thought first maybe I'd get one benefactor to just pay me to do it.
Yeah.
But that was not really realistic. And so I thought, okay, I've got a crowdfund, and I didn't really know how I would do. And if I had never done anything, why would anybody pay me to do it? But I had spent, people knew I didn't make a big deal of the fact that I hadn't been paid, but it somehow had gotten out there. I'd said it once in something, and then, and then I made it clear in my crowdfunding. I said, look, I've been doing this as a public service because I can. I can't do that anymore because I have to actually have a salary and I have to have health insurance. Yeah. And so
you put the call.
And so I put a crowdfunding, and I raised $72,000, which was just, which was just about enough to cover my half-time salary and the exorbitant amounts we have to put in that benefits go for to cover health insurance.
Yep.
So I figured out a way to crowdfund, not to me, but to Berkeley.
Yep.
So I went to an NGO, and then the NGO gave the money to Berkeley.
There you go.
Berkeley was surprised that, they crowdfund and they get a few $1,000s.
Yeah.
It was unusual.
They saw the interest in this case.
Well, I think they were happy to keep me. They just didn't have any money to do it. So they were happy that the money came in and that they could still keep me employed. But what happened was so for the last year, since that was starting in July through this coming June, my job at Berkeley is just to report on this issue. It's not to teach, which I miss. It's not to advise students, which I miss, because there's no money for that for me. So my job at Berkeley now is half-time to do my ME CFS project. And I try to spare a little time to do other freelance work, so I can earn a full salary and not just a half-time salary. Unfortunately, this takes up more time than half-time, but that is what it is.
Yeah.
So that, now I'm doing other crowdfunding starting next week, because basically, my crowdfunded was for a year, it ends in June, and I need another year of salary and benefits for the next from July 18 to June 19.
All right, we'll keep that in mind, guys. David's going to have to crowdfund again.
Can I just say, I really, really, really never wanted to crowdfund. I never wanted to ask the community for money.
Ideal.
I understand patients don't have money. It's not ideal, and I felt bad doing it. However, I did discover that patients wanted to help me continue. And that even the patients who gave $10 wanted to give $10. That's all they could afford. They felt that by giving to me, they were participating in their own. They were helping themselves in their own. So basically, I realized it's still self-serving, but I realized, I was helping them by crowdfunding.
Yep. No, it's true. You are
giving them an opportunity.
People wouldn't have given you the money if they didn't think what you were doing were worthy. So.
Well, and they wouldn't have given me the money if I hadn't actually proven that I was doing something that was needed to be done. So
I think you're in it for the right reasons, and people can tell. So.
Well, the truth is, nobody in their right mind would do this as a career move.
Yeah.
This is not a good career move. Unfortunately, to report on. I think it's changing. I think now people see it's kind of interesting.
I hope so. Yeah.
But when I was doing this, it wasn't like I had a lot of editors, calling me, please write about chronic fatigue syndrome. So it wasn't something that anybody would have done as a career move. I really did it because I saw. It was fascinating. So it's been very intellectually rewarding.
Sure.
As a reporter, you always want to find something nobody else is doing. I was trained at Berkeley to evaluate studies, and so I feel, like...
You're the perfect man for the job, it seems like.
Well, I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I feel like I was doing what my profession as both a journalist and a public health person is what I'm supposed to be doing.
I think you are, yeah. And I can imagine it being more satisfying, but also more difficult being funded by the crowd, essentially. It
creates a lot of challenges because basically it's always possible for the p.a.c.e. authors. Well, I've been criticized by one in particular. Now they're crowdfunding to try to stop my research, as if that's somehow a bad thing. And also, it does make me somewhat beholden to, it creates a conflict of interest because basically I'm getting funded by the people I'm trying to help. And so it is possible to. One could look at my work and say, well, of course he's writing bad things about p.a.c.e. That's what he's being paid to do by the patients. Well, that argument falls apart because I was doing it for 2 years and wrote a mega opus, with no support before anybody was paying me.
I'll refer to your 15,000 words.
Right. I wrote enough for, I wrote many tens of thousands of words past that before anybody was paying me anything.
Exactly.
So
I think that clears that up.
It sort of clears it up and it sort of insulates me from that kind of criticism.
Yeah.
But I still have to just, if I'm writing for whoever, that's now since then when I've gotten some things not on Virology blog but elsewhere, I say, I disclose, David Tuller's position at Berkeley is largely funded by crowdfunding support from the community.
Well, and in that way, your financial ties are so much more clear than the p.a.c.e. authors who have.
Well, so they don't have a lot of grounds for complaining about my conflicts of interest. When they didn't disclose any of their conflicts of interest to the patients they're supposed to have disclosed it to.
Yeah, that's the pot calling the kettle black.
From my perspective, they promised in their protocol to adhere to an international human rights convention, which is called the Declaration of Helsinki, which was created after World War II. It was really adopted, I guess, in the early 60s, but it was sort of developed as a way of to protect participants in studies after the Nazis. And they promised to adhere to it. Now, if you look at the Declaration of Helsinki, it is very specific about what you have to do in terms of informed consent. You have to inform your prospective participants of any possible conflicts of interest. Their consent forms include no mention of their incredible conflicts of interest in terms of the main investigators, in terms of their work for insurance companies, advising insurance companies for decades that these treatments that they're testing in p.a.c.e. work in terms of getting people back to work, and people shouldn't get benefits unless they do these treatments and so on. So they have massive conflicts of interest.
It's a very clear conflict of interest, and it was undisclosed.
And it was undisclosed to the participants. Now, they say, well, we disclosed it to the journals. Well, the Declaration of Helsinki was not written to protect journal editors or to protect journal readers. It was written to protect participants in your studies. If you didn't disclose it, you have absolutely no ethical right, and I don't know about the legality of it, you have no ethical right to publish any of your data. And the journals are, it's disgraceful.
Mm-hmm.
The journals have allowed them to publish, and when I pointed this out repeatedly, the journals don't even respond to this concern. I think the studies need to be retracted, not only because they're garbage and because they violated so many ethical and methodological principles, but because they have no informed consent
Mm-hmm.
to publish any of their data, because
Yeah.
they did not obtain informed consent, because they did not disclose their conflicts.
I follow you 100%. All right, so we fixed the lighting situation a little bit. It's getting a little bit darker in Sydney. So, but the next question I had was related exactly to what you last said about the authors of the p.a.c.e trial not retracting it. Why do you think the Lancet and the authors are so defiant in the face of such sustained and rigorous
They've
criticism?
invested their reputations, and the p.a.c.e authors have spent 30 years promoting this theory. So I think what would like them to do is impossible, because basically, they're too invested in the theory, which is total bunk, to back away from it. And they're too invested in defending their reputations and defending their work. So basically, when you've done something for 30 years, and then people come along and say, not only is your work terrible, but your work is really harmful, and you've actually harmed a lot of people with this. Who's going to be able to retract that? Now, why is the Lancet not retracting it? That's a question for Richard Horton, the editor. I don't know. Richard Horton is the editor. Under his watch, the Lancet published the vaccine autism study, which they then had to retract. When this paper was published, he came to Australia, or I don't know if he came to Australia, but an interview was done on Australian radio. Probably was done. Maybe he was still in England, but Michael Sharp, one of the editors, and Richard Horton, one of the main p.a.c.e investigators, and Richard Horton did an interview on Australian radio where they came out swinging, and Richard Horton came out and elsewhere has said really terrible things about the patients who were protesting. And we got this diatribe of protest and blah, 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 and basically about how great the study was. And so basically he's come out and he put his reputation on the line defending the study. Now that the study has been documented to be completely ridiculous and scientifically incoherent and completely bogus, if he then says, oh, gee, I'm sorry, the evidence was all there way back in the beginning that it was a terrible study, in fact, and so it's kind of too late, I think, for them to back away.
Right, they're too invested.
They're too invested.
It feels like.
Their reputation, but the problem is, it's a cover, it's like any cover-up. The longer you pretend that you're right,
the longer you have to dig in.
The farther you're going to fall once everybody gets wind of it.
Yeah.
Now, anyway.
Yeah, no, I understand completely. They're so entrenched now in their position that they can't hope to dig themselves up.
They can't dig themselves out of it. Yeah. And if they now say, oh, gee, we were wrong, well, everybody has to say, well, one, everybody was telling you were wrong for years. Why are you only now?
Why is it now that you're admitting that? So actually, I've crowdsourced myself, but this time it's just questions that I put out there when I told people I was interviewing you. This one comes from a Reddit user, ASABM. He said, what corrections would you like to see made in the p.a.c.e trials papers, or is outright retraction the only proper? Well,
since my point is that they actually don't have any, they don't have informed consent, that from my perspective, the papers just need to be retracted for that fact alone. I think also the best response to the p.a.c.e trial is there was a study that came out last week that's a reanalysis of all the data that they were forced to release. So basically, and I'm a co-author on that study. There were 7 authors on the study, and in that study, basically documents that what they reported. It reanalyzes the study based on their own original measures that they were supposed to provide, which they never did. Mm-hmm. So what happened was, after they collected all their data, they changed all the way they measured everything, and that produced much better results because they weakened all their outcome threshold, all their outcome criteria. So,
and for that reason, they're saying they don't need to retract it?
Well, they're saying that it doesn't really matter. It's a question. They like their measures better. They like the measures they chose after they collected all their data better. Well, anybody would like the measures you choose after you collect all your data better. They say they never looked at their data, so it doesn't matter that they changed the outcomes. You can't do that. The idea that they didn't know anything about what their findings were is ridiculous. In most trials,
it sounds like it. Well, and what do you make of the researchers' attempts to... They're kind of painting themselves now as these freedom-fighting martyrs in response to the careful criticism that I don't think you're levelling at them, but you're levelling it at the studies.
Well, I mean, I have to say I have total disrespect for them. I've said probably bad things about them. You know, they have.
But that criticism all stems from their work.
Yes, of course. This criticism stems from their work. Their approach is they really can't respond to they make bogus responses that are nonsensical, which I've documented when they try to respond to my long piece. So they have no legitimate responses, and they say, well, we've answered all the questions. Well, you've addressed the question, but you haven't actually answered anything because you keep repeating the same stupid answers that are non-responsive to the question. So
essentially, what they've said is not working. So they're just like, well, now you're just attacking me personally.
Yeah. So now they're like, oh, you know,
I'm getting harassed.
They haven't accused me. They've accused me of things. They can't really accuse me of harassing them because I haven't harassed them. They can't claim I made death threats because I haven't made death threats. You know, they all they can claim is that somehow I'm a bad person or something. I don't know what they think. They certainly don't like me, you know. Yeah. But they've never talked to me.
Right. There you go. So under my specialist instructions, I'm still following the adaptive pacing principles outlined by the UNSW Lifestyle Clinic. The graded exercise therapy and the CBT I've said on this blog before I've found less useful, no path to recovery. And I understand you're talking to some people like myself who've been to the clinic. And can you talk about the sort of things you're hearing so far, or do you need to wait till you officially report?
Well, I can say so today we had a meeting with a number of people who've been to the clinic, and the general sense seems to be, it was actually really helpful. So the clinic's idea is that let's get everybody at a baseline level of pacing, and then we'll kind of go up 20% every couple of weeks, or 20, we'll sort of go up on the get. So they don't start with get, they start with let's establish a low threshold baseline so that you're not having post-exertional malaise, and then we'll kind of slowly get you up. So I would say that of all the people that were there, probably 7 or 8 who'd been in the clinic, a pretty uniform feeling like, the pacing stuff was helpful. The doctors, the physiologist or whatever, they seemed interested and concerned. It was validating to meet people who took our illness seriously and believed that we had an illness, and that the first part was really helpful, and that I still use those techniques. Every single one said the get part, which comes after the pacing part, was unhelpful or harmful. Either they couldn't do it and so they didn't do it, or they did it and they got worse.
And that's exactly what happened to me, and I've shared that experience, and it sounds like a lot of people have had.
Yes, and that seems to be the uniform experience. I mean, again, uniform, I talked to 6 or 7 people. That's not the entire, universe of the clinic.
No,
and probably
no,
the people who did get better from it, if there were not ones who were going to show up at the meeting. So there's a selection bias of the people I talked to. However, it was striking that everybody said more or less the same thing.
Yeah, I was surprised by that as well. I wasn't sure if I'd be an outlier, but I'm interested to read your piece on the lifestyle clinic when
I get to it.
When you eventually get to it, no rush.
But that was my impression, that basically it was a mixed bag. A couple of people said they did feel like they were pressured to do more. Other people said that, well, actually when I said I couldn't, either I stopped going or they said, okay, never mind. There does seem to be a concern at the clinic that people should be getting disability, which is different from the PACE authors in the UK who think that if you're getting social benefits, that it's reinforcing your false illness belief that you have an organic illness. So they basically are on the side of trying to deny benefits to people. At the fatigue clinic, it sounds like if you go through their program and you're still disabled, that they're interested or willing, and they believe that you should have benefits. Yeah. So that's a big distinction.
It's almost a requirement here to
go through benefits. That thing to get your benefits.
Yeah. So and there is some uses to it. So
so it seems like
not fully.
And some people said to me, well, I would actually recommend people go there, but I would recommend that they go there for the pacing.
That's what I say.
And that they
just tell be careful not to push beyond your fixed limits.
The other thing was that a couple of people said, even though they don't talk about recovery, that there was sort of an underlying implication.
It was implied. I felt it was implied.
And that then they were made to feel, or they felt like it was their fault somehow, or if they didn't get better.
Yeah.
So there was it wasn't said exactly, but people seem to have picked up
A strong implication.
that strong implication. If that was your experience?
It was, unfortunately, yeah. I had the major crash in 2011, and then I went back in 2013, and the response was, "Oh, you must have made a mistake," which I guess I believe. But now, following your work, I'm much wiser too. The science wasn't quite there.
So I'm not really sure if they believe there's again, I mean, they have some rationale for why they think people are having crashes, but I don't know, it's still a scientific issue that's being worked out.
Yeah.
It appears to be, from some of the research, that people are having, mitochondrial dysfunctions and dysfunctions in their energy production cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so there really is a maximum that people can do, and if they go over the maximum, they crash.
Yeah.
Their idea seems to be something related to that there's something going wrong with the wiring in the brain, that people are having what they call central sensitization, so that there's something about neurologically their brain's kind of misinterpreting the severity of stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're overreacting physiologically, or they're misinterpreting or hyping the effect of the stimulus. They seem to think it's a physiological thing and not just people are having some weird ideation.
Yeah, they believe it's physiological, but they still think that training it out is the solution.
Right. So, it seems like very much different from the UK, but still very problematic.
I think you're right there. Do you think there's a way for the ME/CFS community to actually bridge the gap between us and those who endorse p.a.c.e, or is it just a lost cause?
Either increasing your amount of activity makes you worse, or it makes you better. It can't do both at the same time. So, if you're convinced that increasing your activity is going to make you better, and other people, patients' experience, that doesn't match patients' experience, that there isn't a possibility of gradually increasing till you're sort of recovered,
mm-hmm.
which is sort of the p.a.c.e theory. I don't see where the common ground can be. Either people have limits, set really hard limits that are imposed by the illness, or they don't.
Mm-hmm. So it's a bridge too far, it sounds like.
So from patients' experience, or many patients' experience, or there's an absolute limit to what they can do.
I feel like it is maybe possible to have more focus on the adaptive pacing and see how that helps. Certainly that's helped me, but a study focusing more on that and then without the GET and CBT versus a placebo group would be more interesting.
Well, certainly people get better or improve. I don't mean get better in the sense that they recover, but they, if they don't overexert themselves, many people seem to gradually be able to do more.
Mm-hmm.
But that's, I think, because they're resting their bodies, not because they're pushing themselves to go beyond their limits.
Yes. This question comes from Reddit user Joseph Stash. What are your priorities for the year ahead?
My priorities for the year ahead are continue. So I think there's been a lot of momentum. There's been significant developments, and I wasn't necessarily thinking I was going to continue this for another year when I started my last crowdfunding. But I see that even though there's momentum, I think it's still important to have someone out there who is reporting and keeping pushing, even though again it's getting covered here more and there. So I think I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. So that's really a combination of. I don't know what it's a combination of, because I've sort of made it up as I go along. I thought when I started I was going to do this, this, and this, and then it turns out other things happen and other studies come out. And I wrote a lot about the NICE guidance. I didn't know I would do about that. I wrote a lot about some of the studies coming out from the University of Bristol from Professor Esther Crawley, and her decision to accuse me of libel and to not explain herself, and that took up a lot of time. I didn't know that Bristol University was going to complain to Berkeley about me to try to shut me up, so that's taken time. So I've reported about that. So there's a lot of things that come up that I don't anticipate. I think a couple things I really need to write about. One is the issues of every country people have problems with getting benefits, so I have to really write more about that. There's a lot of stuff I'm gathering about 1950s outbreak at the Royal Free Hospital. That was sort of the
major
index,
big,
a core thing which gave rise to the name myalgic encephalomyelitis. So I've done interviews with original patients from then. I haven't had time to even write them up.
That sounds fascinating. I'd love to see that.
Well, it is really interesting, but the part of the problem is I've been distracted by the urgency of actually writing about things going on now. That's kind of historical data, and it's interesting, but writing about that now is not necessarily going to help people advance the thing.
Sounds like you've got a few projects on the back burner.
So I have a batch of projects.
Yeah, they all sound fantastic, so hopefully you can get to them. What should ME activists be highlighting to the public in order to raise our profile? You as an outsider, me as a patient, and all the other patients, we feel very almost insulated a little bit. What do you think we should be pushing for?
I don't know, that's a hard question.
To my mind, it's just awareness. People need to know that this is a real disease. Is that...
Yes, I think people need to know it's a real disease. They need to know that it's not fatigue. Mm-hmm. Fatigue is a misnomer. It's, really paralytic exhaustion or, paralysis of a kind, or exhaustive paralysis or paralytic exhaustion, or, it's not, part of the problem with the name is that it just gives people a completely fake idea of what the illness is. So I think something like Unrest, the movie Unrest, has been really helpful at showing people at least what one person's experience is. I know people say, oh, it's not my experience. Well, one film can't show everybody's experience. She's showing her experience. And I think she's showing that her experience is that it's a devastating physiological disease. Mm-hmm. And that's something I can't do in writing. I can't give that visceral experience of it. So I think that's been helpful. I think, obviously, advocating for more research funding. I think once something is discovered, that will...
That's a big key.
That's a big key. If there's a diagnostic test, which, hopefully something will happen. If some treatment proves to be useful, that, I think that's important. So you can do all the awareness you want, but actually once something is found...
that opens a lot more doors.
Now, one of the arguments from the side of those who, the CBT, GET ideological brigades, is that, well, there's nothing better, what do we have to offer people, and so on and so forth. Well, one of the reasons there's nothing better to offer right now is because you've sucked up all the money to investigate this nonsense.
Yeah, and so hopefully when that too gets shut down, then we have more oxygen to...
Right, so my goal is I'm trying to get that thing out of the way so that there's more money and interest in the research.
Yes.
I'm not a doctor, I'm not a biologist. I can't say I think this approach they're doing at Melbourne or this approach they're doing at Griffiths or at Stanford or at Columbia is the best biomedical approach. I have no idea.
But you can say that p.a.c.e
I can say
is
p.a.c.e stinks. And p.a.c.e stinks, and it's awful, and it's been destructive and harmful, and those people should all be completely ashamed of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to back you on that one.
They're not completely ashamed of themselves because they think that...
No, I'm backing you in...
Yes, I know. But why they're not ashamed of themselves, they're
I think
deluded.
As you said,
they're deluded.
I think, as you said, that they're so entrenched now that it's almost
I've come to believe that they genuinely believe that they're doing good science. And that I don't... It's hard for me to believe that people could willfully do such bad science and pretend that it's good. I think they must believe that they're actually doing good science.
I'm sure. There's got to be some mental gymnastics going on there. Reddit user Jamesy Jones wants to know, so far Scott Ludlam, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's the only Australian politician to actively pursue our cause in the Senate, but he had to resign last year during our foreign citizenship crisis. Did you hear about that?
Is he the one with the dual citizenship?
Yes, that was the one. So he's gone now with our biggest ally out of the parliament. Who else in Australia do you know will be receptive to our cause? In the parliamentary sphere.
That's for Australians to figure out, not me.
Okay. Did you meet with anyone while you were in Canberra?
Yeah, in Canberra had several meetings, and I'm just going to post, there was a summary of what we did. We met with the chief medical officer, and so I was there. Also, there were a couple of researchers from the University of Melbourne. One researcher from Melbourne, and then a visiting researcher from University College London that they're working with. So we sort of had some separate meetings. I did a couple of press interviews. But then we had a group meeting, and they met with some parliamentarians and parliamentary aides, hoping to sort of generate some more interest and awareness that there is actually biomedical research going on. We met collectively with the chief medical officer, which I thought was a helpful meeting. He seemed interested and concerned. I had another meeting with someone from NDIA. and they seemed interested and concerned about some of the issues people are facing in terms of getting NDIS support. I think those things, both meetings seem to leave open the room for local, people to continue the dialogue. So I think that was helpful. So I'm hoping that helps move things along at least a little bit.
Okay. How do you think that we can recruit more journalists like you? You've been a fantastic ally, because if I read another lazy headline, chronic fatigue is real, scientists say, I am going to scream like a banshee.
Right. And then they have the photo of the woman like this.
Yeah, just or gently resting.
She's so tired.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know that there are a couple of journalists in the U.S. I mean, part of the problem is journalists have to answer to editors. And my experience of talking to editors is that if I mention this over the phone, say, I can sort of hear their eyes rolling in their head over the phone. So, there's only so many times you can go through that experience and want to continue pitching editors. Now, editors have become a little more interested, but nobody's job, I'm the only person whose job, at least not full-time, since this is supposed to be a half-time job. My half-time job is to report about ME.
Yep.
Nobody, the only reason that's my half-time job is because I've crowdfunded to make that my half-time job. Any other reporters who cover it are going to do it like they're the science reporters, so they have to cover this and that, and then maybe every 6 months there's an ME study out and they can write about ME.
Right.
So I think the press coverage, at least in the US and the UK, has improved significantly in the last couple of years. I can say in the last year in the UK there have been some respectable articles. The our study last week, actually, that was incredible. The Times in the UK, the reporter Tom Whipple, who's a good reporter, a smart guy, he wrote a story about the study that came out last week, the one that pretty much completely rebuts the p.a.c.e trial. And the headline in the Times was something like £5 million study found worthless, worthless in quotation marks.
Accurate.
Which I think is accurate, but you could not pay for a better headline in the Times. More people will see that headline and will come away thinking, they won't read the story, they won't even look at the study. More people will
remember the
see
headline.
that headline, will remember the headline associated with this £5 million of taxpayer money and the word worthless. And that's in fact the case. Somebody's really at some point going to answer for how could they be allowed to waste £5 million without even getting informed consent. And with doing such a scientifically illiterate trial. And that headline alone, you would never have seen that a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, you would never have heard a member of parliament hold a hearing in which she called p.a.c.e one of the biggest medical scandals of the 21st century. That's, and that's reported in the press. That's a big change.
Okay, so you think the journalist is essentially going to reflect the common opinion more rather than
that's not really being too fair to them. I think that journalists are like anybody else. Why should anybody who's a journalist know any better? I didn't know any better until I looked into it. Why should I can't blame the journalist.
And I knew nothing about it before I had the disease.
Before you got sick.
Well, so.
Nobody's interested in it. It's called chronic fatigue syndrome. Why would that interest anybody? Why would a disease with that name interest anybody? So
yeah, it sounds like it always goes back to the awareness, the funding,
and also I think journalists have also become aware that it's not respected scientists against crazy patients. Now, one of the impacts, I think, of the open letters that I orchestrated, both to the Lancet and to Psychological Medicine, which published the recovery paper, was that journalists could now see and could link to, hey, here's a letter with 42 people from Columbia, Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford, University College London, Georgetown, and lots of other well-known places saying this trial is garbage. With the Psychological Medicine letter to that journal, we had 101 experts signing on to that saying you must retract this paper immediately. That's extraordinary because scientists are not in the business of criticizing each other's work just because. They really, really don't want to do that. They mainly just want to do their own work.
Only in egregious cases.
Only in egregious cases. I think this is a really egregious case. When you have people who are recovered and disabled at the same time on your outcome measure, scientists are willing to go to bat for that and say, this is wrong, you can't do that. That's what's happened in this case. And that becomes a completely different framing from crazy patients against eminent scientists.
The last question I have for you is from Reddit user Traveling Brook. She wanted to know, how did you become such a badass motherfucker?
I like that. Maybe it's my genes. I don't know. When people write you and say, thank you so much, you're helping us so much, you've given us hope for the first time. I got an email after my first thing from someone saying, David, this Christmas holiday, fewer of us are going to kill ourselves because you've given us hope. And
that's huge.
If you get an email like that, what are you going to do? You're going to stop? I don't think so.
Well, I really hope your work continues. It's been a pleasure having you today. And
I'm sorry I talked on and on.
That's all right. I'm sure people really want to hear what you have to say. So I hope you have a fantastic stay for the rest of your time. And if people want to look for you, where can they find you?
Just do a search for my name and Virology blog.
And at David Tuller 1 on Twitter?
Oh, yeah, I forget David Tuller 1 on Twitter. I'm easy to find.
All right, fantastic. I'll put those links in the description. But for the meantime, David Tuller,
thank you
very much.
Okay.